Okay, I see that there's about 6 of us on the call. It's Miss Fitz. Can you guys hear me? Okay, hey Daisy, good to see you. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to project a PowerPoint just so you'll have something to look at. I can't see your questions when I've got the PowerPoint screen up, so I'll go back and forth. So I'll talk a little bit about something, then I'll check and see if anybody has typed in a group chat question and answer that, and then kind of proceed and go on from there. So that's the one thing that kind of I can't see both the PowerPoint and your questions at the same time. So I'm going to go back and forth. Hopefully you guys can see the screen. So just to get us started, the Industrial Revolution is a transition in human history from essentially making things by hand, which was largely how materials were produced, to making things by machine. Some historians argue that it's the greatest change in human history since the Neolithic Revolution, which we learned about at first semester, which was around 8000 BCE, and this transition to agriculture because of the dramatic political, social, and economic changes that it brought. One of the first questions that we addressed was, why did industrialization begin in England as opposed to some other European country or China or different part of the world? One of the things that was happening in England was a bit of an agricultural revolution. So the agricultural revolution kind of preceded the transition to manufacturing and industrialization. So there were some inventions like the seed drill from Jethro Tull and a cultivator that enabled farming to be done faster and with less people involved. We also had new crops that were introduced via the Columbian Exchange to Europe, which grew in greater abundance. And so the bottom line was, because of these changes, fewer people were needed to farm. At the same time, there was population growth, largely because of the Columbian Exchange, as we've learned. And so you've got more people who need work, but fewer people who are necessary for farming. So some of the changes that took place in England included the following. There was a lot of pressure put on Parliament to make land available. So the wealthier landowners who were still engaged in farming wanted to acquire more land so that their investment in machinery would be profitable and would pay off. And so Parliament passed a series of laws called Enclosure Acts, which allowed for large landowners to close off common land and to add it to their farms. Why was Parliament willing to do this? Well, one of the other factors that was important that made England a little bit different was England had already experienced political revolution, and they had transitioned to a constitutional monarchy governed by Parliament. There was a large representation of business interests in the House of Commons. And so the Parliament was willing to pass legislation that was friendly to business interests. So the enclosure movement was all about providing additional farmland to the large farmers so that the mechanization of farming was actually profitable. The impact of the enclosure movement was that it created a large supply of cheap labor who now needed work because they could no longer either farm as small farmers or live off of the commons. And so those people became the source of the cheap labor that's going to feed our factories. One of the other factors that was significant for England was that they happened to have the natural resources that were really necessary to this transition to industrialization. So England is basically an island of coal and iron. And coal and iron became two of the most important resources in this transition to industrialization. Coal became the major source of fuel, ultimately for powering the machines. It also became important in the production of iron. It also became important in the production of railroads and steamships and other transportation. In addition, England happens to have a lot of access to water. It's surrounded by ocean on all sides, and there are lots of navigable rivers that crisscross the countryside, which made it easy to facilitate the use of water as a source of power and also as a way to transport raw materials in and manufactured products out. In addition, England was the first, because they needed more infrastructure and the road systems were not great, to really invest privately in the construction of canals. So a number of private enterprises occurred where canal construction was done, and these became very profitable ventures. Okay, so here you kind of get a sense of where the coal fields and the industrial areas are. So just to give you an image of how much we're talking about, if you look at 1800, only about 50,000 people were engaged in coal mining, and that was largely for fuel to kind of heat homes during the wintertime. You go forward to 1880, and you've got 500,000 people engaged in mining. And that just gives you a sense of how important that became. Okay, I'm going to get back to that. I'm going to get back and check on you here and see if anybody, come on. Okay, so let me get back and kind of check in with you guys. So the key things for England is you've got stable government. England's not being riddled by warfare like the rest of the European continent is. They've got the natural resources that they need. They've got a pro-business government because of the makeup of Parliament. They've got capital to invest. So that's the one thing I haven't mentioned yet. They've got money to invest because England had already experimented with the early form of corporations during the Age of Discovery, and that was the joint stock companies. So through the business ventures that people invested in overseas with the joint stock companies, people gained wealth and profit, and they were then able to invest this new wealth and profit into the industrial business ventures. Okay, so everybody okay? Does anybody have any questions they want to type in before I get back to the PowerPoint? Okay. Okay, so just to kind of give you a sense of what starts to happen as we see this transition. There was a decided preference for children and for women in these coal mines, and so one of the major transformations that occurred was a transition in terms of the family and the source of labor. So here's some images of women and children in the coal mine. And look at the production of iron, how much it increases. So before this time period, because we've been talking about iron dating all the way back to about 1200 BCE. That's when the Iron Age occurred. But iron was traditionally very expensive and somewhat rare to mine and manufacture. But during this revolution, the British figured out what they called the puddling process, which was a way that they were able to make iron directly from coal instead of charcoal. So it was inferior iron, but it was cheap and abundant and easy to make. And so iron production really skyrocketed during this time period in a way that it hadn't before. You also have a lot of other innovations during this time period, and one of the main transitions and why textile industry is the first industry to experience industrialization is the textile industry was the main cottage industry in England, meaning that people in their homes were able to spin thread by hand, they were able to sew by hand, and it was a very small kind of system that a lot of families engaged in. With the inventions of things like the water frame, the spinning of thread could be done by machine and much, much faster than could be done by hand. So as we started to see new inventions like the water frame powered by water, the necessity for a location outside of the home to produce textiles became important. And so what we saw was then the creation of the factory system, and the factory system started first in the textile industry. Some of the major characteristics of the factory system: one is concentrating production in one place. So materials, labor, everything, machines, everything is in one place, rather than having it spread out to various households. Where these factories are located is where the power sources are. So originally the factories were located on the river systems because they were powered by water. Later closer to the coal mining operations because they're going to be powered by steam. Initially, it requires a lot of investment. So those wealthy capitalists who had made money from the joint stock companies or from banking in the age of discovery are now buying the land, buying the factory buildings, and buying the machines. What they don't really need is skilled labor. Because all these machines can be operated pretty simply and division of labor occurs so that each person in the factory only has one task, labor is unskilled, which means that it's totally replaceable and can be paid low wages. So the people were not really that crucial because anyone could be trained very quickly to operate some aspect of a machine. This allowed for mass production, so we're producing goods at a much higher rate. So prior to this, England's textiles could not compete with places like India, who were known for, and Egypt, who produced really fine, high-quality textiles. Now, all of a sudden, because of the volume and how cheaply they can produce textiles, they're able to outcompete these other regions, particularly once they start to colonize other parts of the world. Some things to think about that the textile industry drives is the one thing that England doesn't have, or Europe in general, is cotton. Cotton does not grow naturally in Europe. And so they need that raw material. And so that drives colonization in part. It also drives slave labor because what becomes important are those cotton plantations that are going to feed the textile machines. So just to give you a sense of how much it's increased, if you look at 1813, you've got about 2,400 looms operating in England. By 1850, you've got 224,000 and over 1 million workers in the textile industry. So that's a huge transition in this industry. The factory system was very difficult for workers. Most workers were working from 6 in the morning until 9 o'clock at night with only a very short break for lunch. Because of the monotonous work, because they were doing the same task over and over, it was very difficult psychologically, and we kind of talked a little bit in class about how dangerous the interior of the factories were because there was nothing protective around the moving parts of the machinery. One of the things that really made things worse was a major innovation that took place during this time period was gas lighting. So it used to, in the beginning of all of this, the factory had to shut down when it got dark because there was no source of light. But once gas lighting was developed, the factories could be operated much later into the night, creating an even longer and more difficult workday. So here's some images of some textile workers. And again, particularly in the textile industry, women were preferred. Okay, I'm going to go back for a second and just check in on you. See if anybody has any questions for me. Can anyone hear me? So Christine and Laura, are you back? I see Arjun can hear me. Laura and Christine, let me know if you can hear me. Okay, so it must be their machine. It must be their computers. It's just very weird because I can't see your faces. Does anybody have a question so far? Any questions so far before I go back? Okay. All right, so we kind of touched on this a little bit, but some of the new inventions you want to be familiar with in addition to the water frame that we just saw. Industry inventions for weaving. So the flying shuttle was one of the first mechanized machines to weave thread into cloth. And then ultimately we got the power loom, which was even faster, which could be powered by steam. The steam engine is probably the most important innovation of the Industrial Revolution, because it not only facilitated much more powerful machines in the textile industry, it also facilitated much better transportation systems, and that included predominantly the steamship, which made the movement of raw materials and goods way faster than it had been in the previous era. And then also the railroad. And so railroads became a very important mode of transportation in the interior of continents. Just to give you an example of how important the railroad was, if you look at travel times from London to these various cities in the British, Scotland, England, Wales, and that whole territory, you're cutting the trip from London to Edinburgh from 43 hours to 12 hours. So the impact of the railroad cannot be overstated in terms of its ability to facilitate the rapid movement of raw materials going into the factories, and then the rapid movement of manufactured goods leaving the factories to go to market. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about kind of what happens to society as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So you kind of get this division in society between the haves and the have-nots. And we've kind of talked about the bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie, it's this concept of these upwardly mobile middle-class people who become the Nouveau Riche, or the new wealthy people in society. They're not nobility. They're not titled nobility. They didn't gain their wealth by land or inherited wealth. They got rich because they were the capitalists who were able to invest in these new endeavors. I want to point them out for just a second, because I know we talked a lot in class about the impact on women of industrialization, but we focused primarily on working women, the women who were working in the factories. Those are the lower class women. Life really changed for the Nouveau Riche, the bourgeoisie, these women as well. The wives of the capitalists became kind of the Victorian ideal. So we're in the Victorian era, Queen Victoria as the Queen of England, and in the 1850s. And essentially for the Victorian woman, she lived in a totally separate sphere. They called it the cult of domesticity. So the expectation for the upper middle class woman was that she was going to take care of the home place. She was going to oversee the education of the children. She was not going to engage with any of sort of the ugliness that was happening, outside her door, with respect to the factory system and the working class and all of that. So there was a definite division and a difference between how these bourgeoisie women lived and what their priorities were versus these working class women. These women are important because they will become the ones who, because they have so much free time now, they're not working, they have hired domestic help in the household. They're the ones who will ultimately be the advocates for education for women. They are the ones who will be concerned about the rampant alcoholism that develops as a result of industrialization. So they will lead the temperance movement to try to ban the sale and consumption of alcohol. And later in time, these women will be our suffragettes, the women who actively agitate for the vote for women. So when you're, if you get a question that asks you to talk about changing gender roles during the Industrial Revolution, you want to make sure to distinguish between middle-class women, these middle-class women who become the Nouveau Riche or the bourgeoisie, and working-class women who have a very different experience that we'll talk about in a minute. Obviously, the stereotype of the factory owner, all greedy and only interested in, the almighty profit. And so factory work was often likened to slavery and the way people were treated. And so this world developed, often kind of called the upstairs, downstairs life. Any of you that are Downton Abbey fans, you kind of got a sense of that upstairs, downstairs, and looking at the way the service class lived versus the way the bourgeoisie lived. And one of the major impacts of the Industrial Revolution was that the gap between the wealthy and the poor was getting larger and larger. So the working classes were initially much worse off than they were when they lived an agrarian life, even if they were living off the commons. Okay, the have-nots, right? This is the working class. So take a look at a second at the factory wages. So S means shillings, D refers to pence, which is a smaller coin. But as you look, as people get older, the difference between the wages for men and the wages for women is significant. So by the time you're 22 years old, a male is making 17 something shillings, shillings, and a female is only making 8 shillings. So that's a huge difference in terms of the pay scale for men versus women. So you can see why factory owners would prefer women. Factory owners also preferred women, not just because of their because they could pay them lower wages, but because their hands were smaller and they could manipulate the smaller parts of the machinery a little bit easier than the men could. And they were also much more docile and less likely to resist authority. And so the factory owners could take much greater advantage of them in terms of work. Here's an image of kind of what happened to the industrial cities. This is Staffordshire, and here's kind of an image. So obviously there was huge overcrowding. The working class was crowded into tenement housing that was poorly constructed. It often caught on fire. Pollution, smog, all of that was a huge problem. So health, disease became a problem as well. Here's another kind of image to see the crowding. Okay, before we talk about new ways of thinking, I'm gonna check in on you. Okay, anybody have a question so far? Before I kind of talk about the responses to the Industrial Revolution? Okay, I feel so lonely. Nobody's talking to me. Okay, so we touched on this last Friday, and so I'm going to remind you of what we learned about Adam Smith and kind of add a little bit more to it and some of what we looked at with the different documents on Thursday. So the first real response was that the Industrial Revolution was all about capitalism and the opportunity to be free of mercantilist constraints, to not have the government regulating trade or regulating production so that people could maximize their profits, and that innovation could occur because there was going to be competition and people were going to pursue their best interests. So Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, is often described as the father of capitalism. And he's all about laissez-faire economics, which basically is, kind of the government taking its hands off of the economy. And his firm belief is that the economy will regulate itself if everyone operates in their own self-interest, if competition is free, and if we allow the laws of supply and demand to determine market prices. So his idea was that if we all act in our own financial best self-interest, that ultimately will be to the benefit of the society, and that competition sparks innovation, sparks people figuring out how to produce things for lower costs, gets people figuring out how to offer a better product at a better price. And that market price will naturally settle at the place where supply equals demand if the government doesn't try to intervene and regulate it. So Adam Smith is all about pure capitalism, and he also opposes tariffs or anything that would put barriers against free trade with foreign countries as well. One of the other theories that kind of developed during this time period was the Malthusian theory about what was going to happen to the population. So initially, with the agricultural revolution, we're producing more food than ever before, with the efficiency of these machines and with the introduction of better food products from the Americas. However, his theory is that essentially population growth will almost always outpace the food supply ultimately, because essentially what happens is when there's adequate food, people become more confident in the economy and people have more children. If you have a period of peace, which is what England is experiencing, then the natural population correctors like war, disease, famine, those things aren't going to level out the population. So what Thomas Malthus argued was that the only real answer to this problem was that people should delay getting married, and he was talking about the working class, because the working class statistically had more children, that the working class should delay marriage and should restrain themselves and ultimately have fewer children. This was kind of a paternalistic type of philosophy that was, probably, as offensive at the time. But what it led to was really the first interest in developing new birth control methods to try to deal with this issue of population. So you've got these theories coming out in response to the Industrial Revolution. Similar was this theory that basically was called the iron law of wages, which is kind of, a different way of saying the same thing. When wages are high, which is ideal, workers get confident in the economy and they have more children. Having more children then creates a surplus of labor, which then leads to lower wages. And so you're kind of in this vicious cycle where you're always going to end up in a position of having lower wages. Okay, let me check in on you with that before I say anything else. Everybody good so far with these theories? Did the point of crisis just represent the point where there would be an issue with population growth and agriculture? Yes. And so the kind of, it was, remember we read Samuel Smiles, Self-Help and Thrift, and Smiles' theory was that part of the problem is that the poor don't regulate themselves, they make poor choices, they spend their money, etc. So Malthus would be along the same lines of this idea that the poor need to show some self-restraint and not have children, and they should delay marriage, and that will help to not have the population outgrow the food supply, was his theory. Okay, so those were kind of the folks on the right of the response to the Industrial Revolution. On the left side of the response to the Industrial Revolution were people like the utilitarians and then the socialists. So I didn't get a chance to have you look at the fourth document we were going to look at in our debate, but it was going to be a document from Jeremy Bentham, who was a utilitarian, as was John Stuart Mill. And John Stuart Mill is kind of what we call a classic, kind of was a believer in classical liberalism, which is the basic idea of them is that capitalism is good, but there is a role for government even in capitalism, because ultimately we should be looking at what's going to produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people. That's utilitarian, right? That's the most useful thing. So in a pure capitalist society, what can happen is capitalism will only end up benefiting a small few, and therefore that's not the greatest good for the greatest number in society. So there is a role for government to come in and regulate manufacturing to allow some safety nets for workers. So the theory of the utilitarians and the classical liberals was essentially that things like regulating the number of hours that could be worked in a day, putting controls on the age of children that would be allowed to work, maybe requiring some safety, kind of later in time, some safety measures in these factories to protect the health of workers. This is the role of government, to try to ensure that while capitalism is good, that it's actually promoting the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Further to the left are the socialists. And there were kind of two versions of socialists. The early socialists were what we call utopian socialists. And they really felt like everyone should be benefiting from the profit of the factories and not just the capitalists or the factory owners. So what they envisioned was these communities where the factory owner would act as a benevolent benefactor to his workers. And so housing would be provided, schooling would be provided, and the factory owner would have a more fair sharing of the profits with his workers. Robert Owen is one of the primary proponents of utopian socialism. That did not end up being a reality. So there were some experimental communities that tried to operate according to these. But as corporations started to become more modern in their structure with limited liability and shareholders and all of that, having a utopian society undermines profit. And so ultimately those things did not succeed. A little bit further to the left were socialists like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who rejected capitalism entirely, who felt that capitalism was exploitive, that profit was simply the difference between what the workers were paid and what they were actually worth. And so therefore the incentive to exploit your workers in the name of profit was always going to be very high. So what the Marxists believed was that the workers would rise up and would actually seize the means of production, the factories, the machines, the land, and they would operate the machine, they would operate the factories, and they would distribute and share the profits amongst themselves. And what would ultimately develop would be a classless society in which there was no bourgeoisie, there was no proletariat, everyone would be equal. So what Marx, remember, talked about was the proletariat being the workers rising up against the bourgeoisie, seizing the means of production, abolishing private property, and having a more equitable distribution of profit. Okay, let me check in on you. Were the utilitarians ensuring the majority of the population, such as the peasants or the lower class? I'm not sure I'm understanding exactly what you're asking there, but the idea of the utilitarians was that businesses should operate in such a way that they were doing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So the role of government was not to undermine capitalism, but was to put a few regulations in place so that there would be so that more people would benefit from the good that was coming from this profit. Would the people who rose to power, Marx has not become the ones in power? Yes. So what happens, what Marx talked about, Marx's theory started off as economic. And, as in economic terms, there's definitely some appeal to it. When you try to apply it to a political scenario, it becomes far more difficult. And so what those who interpret Marx say, and we'll see this kind of when we get into the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution, is that as part of this transition, there needs to be a temporary dictatorship of the proletariat to facilitate this transition. And that then ultimately there will be no need for government and there will be a classless society. What has happened historically when those who have asserted that they are Marxist have risen to power is that temporary dictatorship never ends. And so the Communist Party becomes the dictatorship of the proletariat, and they kind of have an oligarchy in their government. And so no society has ever made the final transition that Marx envisioned. Okay, so let's look at really what happened. So in England, you kind of had that moderate approach. So you have kind of reform as opposed to a wholesale endorsement of capitalism, and you don't have socialism either. You sort of have more of a utilitarian liberal approach, which is there needs to be some reform to address the worst of the abuses of the factory system. So some things that happened over time, we haven't gotten to abolition yet, but one of the ways in which there was advocacy to try to raise wages was to abolish slavery, because slavery was free labor, and that had a negative impact on wages in Britain. You guys saw a little bit, I think, when you were looking at the 8-hour day documents when we did kind of what was happening in response to the Industrial Revolution. And so the Parliament did appoint a commission called the Sadler Commission, who headed the committee, to look at working conditions in the factory. And they did pass a Factory Act in 1833. And they limited the number of hours that children could work based on their age. So under the age of 9, they could work, I think, 8 hours a day. Between 9 and 13 or something, they could work about 14 hours a day. 12 to 14, I'm not 100% sure, but you get the idea. And then there was also, at this point, that's it. And then later on, we started to see some limitations on women and so on. One of the things that happened that was kind of controversial was poor laws were passed. And so the idea was that they were going to manage the cost of the poor by creating housing for them. So they created these poor houses where people could live, and they would get free room and board and food, but they would owe their labor. So as you can imagine, these environments were awful. And so there was kind of later on rebellion against the poor laws and the poor houses as being kind of abusive places to live, and they were basically treated like slaves in terms of their labor, or they were seen kind of like prisons. But these were all efforts by the government to try to reform some of the problems that had developed as a result of the factory system. You guys also looked at changes in democracy, right? So one of the issues that came to light during this time period was how few people were politically participating in the constitutional government that was England. So a tiny, tiny percentage of the people were participating. And one of the things that was really disproportionate was that the urban areas, these new cities, had almost no say. So you'd have a large, crowded city that had 0 representatives in Parliament, versus a rural area with a tiny population might have 2 or 3 representatives in Parliament. So there was a series of reform bills passed to try to increase the political participation of the industrial cities. So you can kind of see some of the cities that were enfranchised on this map. And ultimately, reform is slow. So the initial bill really only increased the electorate a tiny amount because they still had to be property owners. But little by little, the percentage of the population eligible to vote in Britain gets marginally larger. But just kind of so you can get a sense of how change is slow. Okay, let me check back in with you and see if there's any other questions about that stuff that we just talked about. But just remember, reform was kind of the major response in Britain. Socialism, while it did not take hold, did end up having influence in things like the labor unions. So the ability of the workers to organize themselves and to advocate with management for greater rights, that is, kind of an offshoot of the socialist principles espoused by Marx. So you've got this influence there. Why the cities didn't have much representation is because political participation was based on land ownership. So in the agrarian areas, you've got these large landowners who, there might be a population of 100, but they've got a lot of votes because they own a lot of land. But then you get a city where there's almost no land, right? Everybody's in a densely concentrated area and nobody owns land. Because they're living in tenement housing that's owned by the government, they're not getting any political participation at all. So the way the districts were drawn was unfair. Okay, let me go back and just make a few last points. So kind of going into the end of industrialization. So industrialization happens first in England. What we're going to be studying this week is the French Revolution, and the French Revolution is going to take us through 1815. And the French Revolution is not going to affect just France, it's going to affect all of Europe because our Thermidor, spoiler alert, our Thermidor at the end of the French Revolution is Napoleon, and Napoleon's going to see it as his destiny to try to conquer the world, starting with Europe. So essentially, Europe is going to be disrupted by warfare until 1815. After 1815, we see pretty rapid industrialization on the European continent, and of course they're benefiting from all the knowledge that the British have developed. So France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Northern Italy, we start to see industrialization happen throughout Western Europe, continental Europe as well. So that transition happens by about 1850. Along with that transition is the rapid construction of railroads. So continental Europe does not have the same benefit in terms of access to water systems as much as England does, but they do have a great ability to develop railroads, and so industrialization and the key source of transportation in continental Europe will be railroads. As we've said before, once we get through the revolution of the British colonists and the establishment of the United States, similarly, industrialization would take place there, but really not rapidly until after the end of the Civil War. So they kind of get disrupted by the Civil War. Last thing here, just to kind of show you kind of the manufacturing output, just to give you a sense of who our key producers are going forward. So you see the United Kingdom is kind of the leader, but it doesn't take long for places like Germany and France to be important contributors as well. And then later on in time, the United States. Okay, so those are the main things that I wanted to make sure I covered with you. I'll answer any more questions that you might have. Do you feel like you have a good understanding of the Industrial Revolution? Okay, so it looks like nobody else has a question. Are we good? Okay, if you think of a question that you didn't think of tonight, you can, of course, always ask me in class. But thank you for participating, and I will see you tomorrow.